For this housing forum, it's brought to you courtesy of API in partnership with CAF and the AUHF. AUHF is the African Union for Housing Finance. It's a member organization that has individuals and institutions who have interest in housing and housing markets. There are around 72 members so far, represented across 23 African countries. You're very much welcome to engage in all the sessions. We have 3 main sessions. In those sessions, we'll have panel discussions and we'll have presentations. And just to begin us off, our first session will be looking at affordability and sustainability. We'll start by trying to frame the question for that session, and that's going to be through a presentation by Alan Mutuma. Welcome on stage, Alan. Alan is the Open Access Manager at CAF. He's a real estate and research investment professional with approximately 10 years of experience in affordable housing. Prior to working with CAF, he was at Centum, in charge of transactions, research, and strategy. Welcome, Alan.
Thank you, Beatrice, for that kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. Good morning once again. Yeah, I'm glad to be here this morning to share with you a couple of insights regarding sustainability and affordability. And I want to start off by thanking the API team and the CAF team as well, led by Beatrice, Tandio, and the AUHF team for organizing this forum. And this is the first of 2 presentations that I'll be making today. The first one being on framing the broad questions on sustainability and affordability. And then I'll also carry out a short presentation on construction cost analysis. So yeah, I hope we'll be able to have an engaging session post these presentations. Yeah, so most of the data that I will provide within this presentation can be found in our Affordable Housing Yearbook and the 2022 edition, where we focus primarily on the matters of sustainability and housing. And yeah, I think my starting point for this conversation is on highlighting the fact that climate events or climate emergencies or climate risks are real and present, and they have been impacting our environment. Over the past 3 decades, I think it's an observable phenomenon where a number of these climate risks have been occurring, and they've been having serious and obvious impacts in our environment. So as you can see from the graph on the left, it is able to record, or it shows the different climatic shocks that have been recorded within the continent from 1981 all the way to 2022. I know the text is a bit small, but I think the point of that particular graph is to show that the number of reported climate events from 1980 has increased from about 20 events all the way to a high of 90 events. So that's a 4 times increase over a 30-year period where more climate events are being recorded. And what do I mean by climate events? These are floods, droughts, wildfires, and these are actually reported over that period of time. And according to the African Economic Outlook, 5 in every 10 countries where a climate event is reported actually exist in Africa. And I think sometimes the risk with this conversation is assuming that climate events are far removed from our environment. And the point that I'm trying to make is they're actually closer than we would want to think. From the graph on the right-hand side, it now notes the number of climate events that have been reported in different African countries. And again, apologies for the small text, but the point that I want to make is Kenya has had the 4th highest reported climate events from 1980 to 2021. And these ones stand at about 90 events, and majority of them are floods, droughts, and just floods and droughts. So Kenya ranks very highly in terms of the susceptibility to climate shocks in comparison to other African countries. So it's a conversation that needs to be had in terms of where do we place this conversation of climate vis-a-vis the housing conversation. Now, the other point that I want to make as relates to housing, sorry. Where should I point? Yes. So the other point that I want to make when it comes to housing is the fact that climate change is leading to a very interesting phenomenon, that it is actually exacerbating the rate of urbanization. And the question is why. One of the interesting bits is that rural areas are actually more disproportionately affected by climate housing. If you look at the example in Kenya, floods and droughts disproportionately affect areas out of urban centers. And what that then it does, it leads to a migration into urban centers. And if cities are not planned adequately to be able to take care of the affordable housing need, it then moves individuals to settle in informal settlements, which is interesting because people migrate from rural areas and come to urban centers. And then because there aren't sufficient houses in urban centers, they have to live in informal settlements. And then in informal settlements, they are the ones who are most impacted by climate events again. So it's like a cycle of events that then does not or disproportionately affects those from lower income segments. So again, that's one of the very interesting points that we noted. Now, from a policy perspective, I think I wanted to ask ourselves what is happening in this space. And one of the things that we noted is that Kenya contributes less than, Kenya contributes less than 1% of global greenhouse emissions, and it's in the process of implementing several climate-related policies. So in terms of what we are doing in the Kenyan space to remedy the climate policy, or climate space, first we have the Climate Change Amendment Bill, which I think is currently going through the parliamentary processes. Then we've also developed the nationally determined contribution policy, which aims to reduce carbon emissions from 32% by 2030. And these NDC's targets have then led to a long-term emission development strategy that should be able to cater for the National Climate Change Plan. Now, what am I saying with all these words? I think the point that I'm trying to make is that there have been a number of policies that are being made within the Kenyan space, but the gap that exists is that most of these policies are not geared towards housing. Majority of them have to touch on agriculture, sustainable energy, and carbon trading. So I think there exists a gap within this space to be able to develop climate change policies that have to do with housing. So a lot of work is being done in the climate change space, but there still exists a critical gap when it comes to how do those policies interface with housing. Now, the next point that I would want to make is, what is this relationship between climate change and housing? And in that particular yearbook of 2022, the opening sort of introduction to that particular yearbook was able to outlay this very well, but I'll take us through a summary of that. When we talk about climate change, the natural assumption that we usually make is that housing is the one that sort of contributes to this climate change. But I think one of the points that I want to make and emphasize is that there is actually a two-way relationship between climate and housing. So on one end, climate does affect housing, and on the other hand, housing also affects the climate in terms of the embedded carbon. And what this chart shows is that it's a disaggregation of housing during the construction period and during the maintenance period. So during the construction period, it is obvious that the embedded carbon in the materials that we use tend to contribute to greenhouse emission of gases that then affects the climate. And on the other hand, when it comes to the useful life of a house, the efficiencies when it comes to water efficiency, energy efficiency, and sanitation also can affect the environment that we live in. But what we often ignore is the converse, where the environment impacts housing. So for instance, for the developers in the room, if you're in a construction site and rain breaks out for 3 or 4 days, there are actual construction delays that happen, and that needs to be quantified in terms of what is the cost of those particular delays, because most of the conversations when it comes to construction programs rarely account for changes in weather patterns, which is an important aspect that we need to start considering, because if this sudden rainfall starts in the middle of construction, it can actually lead to significant delays, especially if you're doing excavation and stuff like that. So there is a very real present threat in terms of how the environment impacts the process of construction. Then secondly, the other thing that we need to talk about is housing resiliency. The climate risks usually impact the resiliency of housing. Are we thinking about how our houses are going to be impacted 50, 30 years from now in terms of the useful life of the house? Because the environmental aspects tend to affect the livability or the resiliency of a house 20, 30 years from now. And that's one of the things that we need to consider when we're doing our assessment in terms of the relationship between climate and housing. The next point that I would want to make is, from a data perspective, what are we seeing? Because it's one thing to be able to identify the direction of the relationship between climate and housing, but there needs to be a conversation in terms of what tangible data can we be able to collect from this point of view. And I think the note that we want to make here is that data on climate forecast activity is still scarce in the area. What we would want to be at, or where we would want to be at, is be at a position where we can be able to collect both quantitative and qualitative data in terms of what the impact of housing is on the environment and vice versa. But outside of the scarce data that exists, as CAF, we did make an attempt in our market shaping indicators to collect data on climate and housing. And we sought to do it in 2 ways. One, we sought to do quantitative measures where we could be able to collect climate data and see what impact it's had on housing, and qualitative data. On the quantitative aspects, we weren't able to collect much, and this was focused on 6 different countries. But on the qualitative aspects, we did issue questionnaires across 6 different countries where we wanted to start rounding out the picture in terms of what climatic themes exist within that space. And we collected data on what dominant climate risks exist in different countries, what extent do suppliers offer off-grid infra products, and to what extent green financiers exist within these different spaces. The output of that particular data collection is on our website, but suffice it to say that the themes on green and the existence of green financiers within different markets was not that strong. So it just leaves or points to the fact that there is still a long way to go in terms of being able to accurately round out the picture in terms of what the nexus of climate and housing really is. So in a nutshell, that's what I wanted to take us through in terms of climate. Now, the second note is on affordability. And yeah, just before this conversation, I think I overheard a conversation in terms of what do we define as affordability. And I was reflecting on this, and in most of these forums, I think this question keeps coming up because there isn't yet like a concrete definition of affordability. So for this particular conversation, what I thought was to use the indicator that we usually use in our annual year affordable housing yearbook, where we have a metric on the price of the cheapest newly built house across different countries. So this metric is collected across all 54 countries, but for the sake of this conversation, we focused on the data for East Africa. And as we can see, the cheapest newly built house, or the most affordable built house by a formal developer, ranges from $99,000 all the way to $7,000. And this data is for 2023. So that is a range of what is defined as the cheapest newly built house within this space. And then the question then begs is who can afford this house? And outside of income data that is usually provided by GCID, we then sought to collect data on what the average teacher earns and what the average policeman earns. And as I was preparing for this, I wanted to see what percentage of teachers and policemen make up the civil service in Kenya. And the civil service has about 923,000 people. And interestingly, teachers account for 300,000 of those, and policemen for 100,000 of those. So from a proxy perspective, the teacher and policemen are actually account for half of the civil service in Kenya. So as far as proxy goes, it's a pretty strong proxy. And I'll focus on Kenya. The reason I highlighted Uganda and Tanzania was for ease of reference. So in Kenya, an average teacher earns $231 a month, while a policeman earns about $283 per month. The question was then, if we applied the normal mortgage metrics, what kind of houses can they be able to afford? So assuming you're able to pay a 30% deposit, and then the balance of the mortgage terms are country specific, so maybe a 20-year mortgage at a price of 15%, it yielded that the prices of houses they could afford is $5,000 and $6,000. And in comparison to the cheapest newly built house, it's below that. And that's the same theme across the different countries in East Africa. So there is a real question in terms of affordability when it comes to the households that we are providing these houses for. And I think it's a theme that has been repeated severally, that the issue of affordability actually comes back to the income discussion, because we are operating in very low income environments. And maybe then what we should ask ourselves is, should we talk about affordable ownership, or as some from Evida like saying, affordable rental? Because I think maybe that's the real conversation that we need to be having as developers, how we can be able to sustainably develop houses from a rental perspective. I think it also begs the question that the houses being built under the AHP program, one should be able to benchmark them with these particular salaries to then ascertain, what levels of income they're really building out for. So I think the final slide is, so what, and what next? On one end, I did try to make the case that climate events and climate risks have significantly increased over the last 30 or so years. And on the other hand, we have like a real debacle when it comes to affordability, because we are operating in low-income environments. And I think the point that I wanted to make here is, many times when we discuss about green affordable, we are always looking at the outcome of the house being green. But there needs to be more interventions put in place, not just in the final product, but along the entire value chain of housing. I think that's when we can really start to be honest about having a sustainable sort of conversation within the housing space. So all these interventions just can't happen at the final unit being developed. It needs to happen at the land and infra level, where we ask ourselves, what are the energy sources, what are the energy mixes being provided in these particular houses? Under construction and investment, what percentage of construction inputs are we importing, and what are we manufacturing locally? And this is where companies like KKL should really be supported to grow. And I was having a conversation with a developer who has also resorted to going into developing their own construction materials, on one end to try and improve their margins, but on the other end to also try and become sustainable as a developer. Then on the sales and rental perspectives, this is where the biggest gap, I think, exists from a housing finance markets perspective, that we don't have enough green finance providers within the space. We don't have conversations adequately about green mortgages and what that means for or potential offtake. So green products and building systems are really not in existence in these markets, and these are conversations that we need to start having. On the enabling environment piece, I think some work, some tangible work is happening around this space, thanks to the team at KGBS, and also what you can see around the IFC Edge space. But I think more still needs to be done. So there are policies around building codes to be able to support green building, bodies like the Green Building Councils that exist. But I think also from a tax and monetary incentives piece, this needs to be strengthened to be able to crowd in more investments within this space. I think apart from the Econ Green Bond, yeah, there hasn't been that much support to be able to bring more products within this market. So yeah, I think the point that I just want to conclude at is the fact that green is not just the end product of the house when you talk about housing. It is the interventions that we need to make across the entire housing value chain that are really going to bring out the theme of sustainability. And then when it comes to affordability, it's a conversation that I'm not sure will ever end, but we also need to start thinking about what aspects of ownership are we really talking about, because maybe what we just need to be providing more adequately are decent houses for individuals to be able to rent. I think that's it. Thank you very much.